What if what you call normal is not natural at all, but carefully constructed? What if the routines of your daily life, the exhaustion you carry, the inequality you witness, and the powerlessness you are taught to accept are not accidents of history, but the very foundations of a system designed to endure by your obedience? The greatest victory of domination is not achieved through chains, but through consent, through the quiet agreement to live within limits imposed by others. Every society proclaims its order to be inevitable. The ruling ideas of every epoch present themselves as common sense, as reason, as the only way the world can function. Yet these ideas do not fall from the sky. They emerge from material conditions, from the organization of production, from relations in which a minority commands wealth and power while the majority labors to sustain them. What is called normal is merely the everyday expression of exploitation, made invisible by repetition. Capitalism does not rule through morality or wisdom. It rules through ownership. A small class controls the means by which life is produced: factories, land, machine, technology, while the rest are compelled to sell their labor to survive. From this unequal relation flows profit, and from profit flows power. The worker produces wealth but does not own it. The worker creates value but receives only a fraction of it back in wages, while the surplus is accumulated by those who do not labor. This theft is legalized, rationalized, and defended as economic necessity. Alienation is the hidden wound of this system. Labor becomes something external, forced, performed not to fulfill human potential, but to avoid hunger and insecurity. The product of labor stands opposed to its creator as an alien power. Human creativity is reduced to a commodity. Time itself is sliced into units for sale, and life is subordinated to the demands of profit. Under such conditions, even suffering is normalized. Exhaustion is called discipline. Poverty is called failure. Inequality is called merit. The ruling class survives not only by extracting value, but by dividing those who produce it. Workers are set against one another by nation, race, religion, gender, and skill, taught to see competitors instead of comrades. As long as those who labor remain fragmented, capital remains secure. Unity, therefore, is not merely a moral ideal, it is a material threat. Solidarity exposes the illusion that exploitation is personal rather than systemic. History is not the story of harmony but of struggle. Every advance in human freedom has emerged from conflict between those who hold power and those who are denied it. Feudalism fell not because it was inefficient, but because it became intolerable. Capitalism, too, carries within itself the contradictions that will undo it. The concentration of wealth, the recurring crises, the reduction of human beings to instruments of profit, these are not failures of the system, but its logical outcomes. Revolution does not begin with weapons or barricades. It begins in consciousness. It begins the moment people recognize that what they have been taught to endure is neither just nor eternal. When the spell of inevitability breaks, when obedience gives way to questioning, the foundations of domination begin to crack. To refuse the normal is to reclaim the ability to imagine a different world, a society organized around collective ownership and democratic control of production is not a utopian dream but a rational necessity. Only when the means of life belong to all can labor become a free expression of human capacity rather than a source of misery. Only then can production serve human needs instead of private accumulation. Freedom is not found in the market's false choices, but in the collective power to shape the conditions of existence. The task is clear: to organize, to educate, to unite, not as isolated individuals seeking escape, but as a conscious force seeking transformation. The old world will not collapse from moral persuasion alone. It must be overcome by collective action grounded in material reality. Those who produce everything have nothing to lose but the conditions that bind them, and everything to gain in a society built on equality, dignity, and shared power. The revolution begins not tomorrow, not elsewhere, but now, at the moment. You refuse to accept the normal and choose instead to make history. What is called normal in society is rarely the product of nature or necessity. It is the outcome of historical processes shaped by power, ownership, and material interests. The rhythms of work, the hierarchy of wealth, the acceptance of inequality, and the resignation to exhaustion are presented as common sense, as if no alternative could ever exist. Yet this normality did not emerge organically from human needs, but from specific economic relations that benefit a minority while disciplining the majority into compliance. By repeating these conditions daily, society trains people to mistake endurance for stability and suffering for inevitability. The illusion of normality functions as one of the most effective tools of exploitation. When long hours of labor are treated as virtue, when insecurity is framed as personal failure, and when poverty is explained as a lack of effort rather than a structural outcome, exploitation disappears behind moral language. The worker is taught to internalize blame for conditions imposed from above. In this way, domination no longer needs constant force. It operates through habit, belief, and resignation. What is most violent about this process is not only the extraction of labor, but the shaping of consciousness to accept it. Capitalist society depends on this illusion to reproduce itself. The sale of labor power is presented as a free exchange between equals, yet one party owns the means of survival while the other owns only their capacity to work. This imbalance is hidden beneath contracts, wages, and legal formalities that portray exploitation as fairness. The worker enters the market already coerced by necessity, but the system calls this coercion choice. Over time, this distortion becomes normal, and questioning it is dismissed as unrealistic or dangerous. Normality also fragments resistance. By isolating individuals and framing social problems as personal struggles, the system prevents people from recognizing their shared condition. Unemployment becomes a private shame, debt a personal mistake, exhaustion an individual weakness. The collective nature of exploitation is concealed, ensuring that anger is directed inward rather than upward. As long as suffering feels lonely and unconnected, it remains politically harmless. This illusion is reinforced through institutions that claim neutrality. Education teaches obedience to schedules and authority long before it teaches critical thought. Media celebrates wealth while ignoring the labor that produces it. Law protects property with relentless precision while treating human need as secondary. Together, these forces naturalize inequality and present it as the rational order of things. Those who benefit from this order appear deserving, while those crushed by it are portrayed as exceptions rather than evidence of systemic failure. History reveals that what is considered normal shifts whenever power shifts. Feudal obligations were once unquestionable. Slavery was once lawful. Child labor was once routine. Each of these systems relied on the belief that no other arrangement was possible. They collapsed not because they were inefficient, but because people ceased to accept them as normal. The same is true of capitalism. Its injustices persist not because they are invisible, but because they are familiar. The greatest danger of normality is not that it deceives, but that it numbs. When exploitation becomes routine, outrage fades, and imagination shrinks. People learn to adjust their desires downward, to hope for survival rather than freedom. The capacity to envision a different social order is eroded, replaced by the belief that reform at the margins is the highest ambition allowed. In this state, even resistance is domesticated, reduced to gestures that leave the foundations untouched. To expose normality as an illusion is to disrupt the psychological basis of domination. It reveals that what appears stable is fragile, what appears eternal is temporary, and what appears natural is constructed. This recognition does not arise from abstract theory alone, but from lived contradiction, from the gap between human potential and lived reality. When people begin to sense that their suffering is shared, structured, and unnecessary, the illusion weakens. The refusal to accept the normal is therefore not an act of rebellion, born of impatience, but an act of clarity born of understanding. It is the moment when people recognize that exploitation survives by disguising itself as everyday life, and that behind the routines of work and consumption lies a system that requires inequality to function, a system whose greatest strength is convincing those it exploits that this is simply how the world works, that nothing fundamentally different can or should exist, that adaptation is wisdom and obedience is realism. that questioning the foundations is naive, that endurance is maturity, that the limits imposed on life are natural, rather than imposed by human hands, maintained through ownership, enforced through institutions, and preserved through the quiet acceptance of conditions that were never meant to serve the many but to protect the power of the few, as long as this acceptance continues to shape thought, behavior, and expectation. Capitalism presents itself as a moral system, one that claims to reward hard work, intelligence, and discipline. Yet beneath this moral language lies a far more concrete foundation: ownership. Those who possess the means of production command power, not because they are wiser or more virtuous, but because they own what others must use to live. Factories, land, machinery, capital, and now data and technology are monopolized by a minority. And this ownership grants them authority over labor, time, and social life itself. Merit is invoked only after this power is secured, serving as a justification rather than a cause. The capitalist does not rule because they work harder than the worker, but because they control access to work. The laborer enters the workplace already dispossessed, compelled to sell their labor power in order to survive. This relationship is not a moral exchange between equals, but a structural imbalance rooted in property relations. The wage appears as fair compensation, yet it represents only a portion of the value produced. The remainder, the surplus, is appropriated by the owner not through effort but through legal entitlement. Profit, therefore, is not a reward for contribution, but a consequence of ownership, enforced by law and custom. Morality enters the picture only to conceal this reality. Success is framed as virtue, wealth as evidence of character, poverty as personal failure. These narratives transform structural inequality into individual judgment. The capitalist is praised as a job creator, while the worker who creates value is rendered invisible. Exploitation is reframed as opportunity, and domination is softened into leadership. In this way, capitalism cloaks its material foundations in ethical language designed to prevent scrutiny. Merit itself becomes distorted under such conditions. Talent and effort matter only insofar as they serve accumulation. Innovation is celebrated when it increases profit, ignored when it serves human need without return. A worker may labor with skill and dedication for decades and remain insecure, while an owner may inherit wealth and multiply it without labor. The system does not ask who contributes most to society, but who owns the leverage to extract value from others. Ownership also shapes the boundaries of possibility. Those who control capital determine what is produced, how it is produced, and for whom. Entire communities rise or fall based on investment decisions made far from the lives they affect. Human needs that do not promise profit are neglected, while destructive industries flourish if they generate returns. This is not a moral failure of individuals, but the logical outcome of a system in which ownership governs priorities. The law plays a central role in maintaining this arrangement. Property rights are treated as sacred, enforced with precision and violence, if necessary, while the right to a dignified life remains conditional. A factory can be defended by police, but a hungry family is told to wait for the market. This asymmetry reveals the true ethical hierarchy of capitalism, where ownership outweighs humanity and legality substitutes for justice. Even competition, often praised as a moral purifier, serves ownership rather than merit. Those with capital can survive losses, absorb rivals, and shape markets, while those without are crushed by risks they did not choose. The playing field is never equal, because history itself has distributed property unequally. Capital accumulates, reproducing power across generations, while labor remains precarious. What appears as fair competition is in reality a struggle already decided by possession. Capitalism depends on the belief that wealth reflects worth, yet this belief collapses under examination. If morality truly governed distribution, those who teach, heal, build, and sustain life would command the greatest security. Instead, they are often the most exploited. The system rewards proximity to ownership, not contribution to well-being. This contradiction is not accidental. It is essential. To understand capitalism, one must strip away its moral language and confront its material core. Ownership determines power, power determines distribution, and morality is adjusted afterward to justify the outcome. As long as a few own what the many need, Inequality will persist regardless of rhetoric. The question is not whether capitalism can be made fair through better values, but whether a system built on exclusionary ownership can ever serve collective human flourishing when its survival depends on maintaining a divide between those who own and those who must submit their labor to survive, a divide that shapes consciousness, politics, culture, and everyday life, presenting domination as fairness and accumulation as virtue as long as ownership remains concentrated and treated as untouchable. Under capitalism, labor ceases to be a meaningful expression of human creativity and becomes instead a mechanism of survival imposed by necessity. The worker does not labor to fulfill a purpose chosen freely, but to secure wage required to exist within a system that denies access to life without payment. This compulsion transforms work from a conscious activity into an external force, something endured rather than lived. Labor becomes detached from the worker's essence, no longer an extension of human potential but a condition forced upon it. Alienation begins at the moment the worker loses control over what they produce. The product of labor does not belong to its creator, but to the owner of the means of production. What the worker brings into existence stands apart as something foreign, even hostile, returning only as a commodity to be purchased, or as profit accumulated by another. The more the worker produces, the more powerful this alien force becomes, while the worker's own life becomes poorer in time, energy, and autonomy. This separation extends beyond the product to the process itself. Labor under capitalism is organized to maximize efficiency and profit, not human fulfillment. Tasks are fragmented, repetitive, and stripped of creativity, reducing the worker to a replaceable function within a vast machine. Thought is separated from action, planning from execution, leaving the worker alienated from their own activity. Work no longer affirms life but drains it, turning hours into units sold and energy into something extracted. Alienation also manifests in the worker's relationship to other people. Instead of cooperation toward shared goals, capitalism fosters competition for wages, positions, and security. Workers are set against one another, forced to compete in a market where scarcity is engineered to discipline labor. Solidarity is undermined, and social bonds are weakened. Human relations become transactional, measured by utility rather than mutual recognition, while collective power dissolves into isolated struggle. From this alienation flows inequality. Because workers do not control production, they cannot control distribution. The value they create is appropriated and concentrated, while they receive only enough to reproduce their labor. Wealth accumulates at one pole, poverty and insecurity at the other. This inequality is not a deviation from capitalism, but its necessary condition. Profit requires surplus, and surplus requires unequal relations between those who own and those who labor. As productivity increases, inequality deepens rather than disappears. Technology that could reduce labor time and expand freedom is instead used to intensify work, displace workers, or extract more value from fewer people. Gains that should benefit all are captured by owners, while workers face longer hours, precarious employment, and constant anxiety. The promise that progress will lift everyone masks the reality that progress under capitalism serves accumulation before humanity. Alienation also reaches into consciousness. When labor is experienced as meaningless or hostile, individuals begin to feel estranged from themselves. Life is divided between work that exhausts and leisure that merely restores the capacity to work again. Dreams are narrowed to survival, and aspirations are disciplined by fear of unemployment and debt. This psychological alienation reinforces inequality by limiting the imagination of alternatives, making exploitation feel inevitable rather than constructed. Capitalism further alienates people from society as a whole. Decisions that shape millions of lives are made by a few based on profitability, not collective need. Communities are built and destroyed by market forces beyond their control. Workers experience society as something done to them, not something they shape. This powerlessness deepens inequality by removing democratic influence over the conditions of life. The system then blames individuals for the consequences it produces. Those crushed by alienated labor are told they lack ambition or adaptability. Structural inequality is reframed as personal failure. This ideological reversal protects the system by directing frustration inward rather than toward the relations that generate it. Alienation thus becomes self-reinforcing, shaping not only material conditions but beliefs and identities. Labor under capitalism cannot escape these outcomes because the system depends on them. To abolish alienation and inequality would require transforming the relations of production themselves, restoring collective control over labor and its products. As long as labor remains something sold under compulsion, and as long as its fruits are appropriated by others, work will remain a source of estrangement, and society will remain divided between those who command and those who endure, between those who profit from labor, those whose lives are consumed by it, reproducing alienation in daily routines, inequality in social structures, and powerlessness in human experience, sustained through ownership, discipline, and the normalization of conditions that deny workers their full humanity. The power of the ruling class does not rest solely on wealth or force, but on fragmentation among those who labor. A united working class possesses the numerical strength, productive capacity, and collective leverage to challenge domination, which is precisely why unity is treated as a threat. Division is not accidental, it is cultivated, refined, and maintained as a central strategy of rule. When workers are separated from one another, their shared condition is obscured, and their potential power is dissolved into isolated struggles. Capitalism thrives by encouraging workers to see themselves as competitors rather than comrades. The labor market transforms survival into a contest, where employment, wages, and security appear scarce and conditional. Under these conditions, solidarity is discouraged, and mistrust becomes rationalized as self-preservation. Workers are pushed to believe that another worker's gain must come at their own expense, diverting attention away from those who profit from the system as a whole. This division is reinforced through social categories that precede the workplace but are weaponized within it. Differences of race, nationality, religion, gender, and language are exaggerated and politicized to fracture collective identity. Instead of recognizing exploitation as a shared material reality, workers are encouraged to blame one another for declining wages, unemployment, or insecurity. Migrants are blamed for job loss, minorities for social instability, women for lowering wages, while the owners who benefit from cheap and divided labor remain protected from scrutiny. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining these divisions. The ruling class promotes narratives of individualism, teaching workers to interpret success and failure as purely personal outcomes. Collective struggle is portrayed as outdated, dangerous, or unrealistic, while personal advancement is framed as the only rational path. This isolates workers psychologically, convincing them that cooperation is naive and resistance futile. The belief that one might escape exploitation individually undermines the desire to abolish it collectively. Even within organized labor, division is encouraged through hierarchy and differentiation. Skilled workers are separated from unskilled, permanent from temporary, formal from informal. Privileges are unevenly distributed to create layers of loyalty and resentment. Those slightly better off are encouraged to identify upward with management, rather than sideways with fellow workers. This stratification weakens collective bargaining power and ensures that resistance remains fragmented and negotiable. Nationalism further entrenches division by aligning workers with the interests of their own ruling classes. Instead of seeing exploitation as a global condition produced by capital, workers are taught to identify with national economies and compete against workers elsewhere. Wars are justified, trade rivalries celebrated, and austerity accepted in the name of national strength, while capital moves freely across borders, unburdened by the loyalties imposed on labor. The preservation of ruling class power depends on preventing workers from recognizing themselves as a class. Class consciousness is dangerous because it transforms private grievances into public demands. It reveals that exploitation is not the result of individual failure, but of structural relations maintained for profit. When workers understand this, their struggles converge, and their demands escalate beyond reforms toward transformation. History demonstrates that moments of genuine threat to ruling power have always coincided with periods of worker unity. When divisions weaken, strikes spread, movements grow, and the legitimacy of existing institutions collapses. This is why repression intensifies whenever solidarity emerges, and why concessions are offered selectively to break momentum. The ruling class fears unity because it exposes the fragility of its control. Division also distorts political representation. Workers fragmented along identity or sectoral lines are easily manipulated by parties that promise protection to some while sacrificing others. Electoral politics becomes a competition of grievances rather than a challenge to ownership and power. The system absorbs dissent by channeling it into controlled forms that leave the underlying structure untouched. As long as workers remain divided, exploitation can adapt and survive. Each group struggles separately, wins partial gains or suffers isolated defeats, while the system as a whole remains intact. Unity threatens not just profits, but legitimacy. It challenges the narrative that inequality is natural, that hierarchy is necessary, that obedience is rational. The ruling class understands this instinctively, which is why it invests so heavily in maintaining division through culture, policy, and ideology. To overcome this fragmentation requires more than shared suffering, it requires shared understanding. Workers must recognize that their differences are used against them, that their struggles intersect, and that their liberation is collective or not at all. The moment division gives way to solidarity, power shifts, because those who produce everything begin to act as one, dissolving the illusions that keep them apart and exposing the dependency of the ruling class on a workforce. It can rule only as long as it remains separated, competing, mistrustful, and unaware of its own collective strength. Class consciousness emerges when individuals recognize that their personal struggles are not isolated misfortunes but expressions of a shared social condition rooted in material relation. It is the moment when private hardship becomes understood as collective exploitation, when workers see themselves not as scattered individuals competing for survival, but as a class bound together by their position within the system of production. This awareness does not arise automatically from suffering alone, because suffering can just as easily produce resignation or self-blame. It arises when experience is interpreted, when reality is named, and when the structures behind everyday life are made visible. Capitalism works relentlessly to prevent this recognition. It fragments experience, teaching people to see their lives as separate stories disconnected from broader forces. Success is individualized, failure privatized, and inequality moralized. In such conditions, workers may feel anger or despair without understanding its source. Class consciousness cuts through this confusion by revealing that exploitation is systemic, not accidental, and that the power exercised over labor is organized, not random. It replaces the question, "What is wrong with me?" with "What is wrong with the system that produces these conditions?" This shift in understanding transforms identity itself. A worker who sees themselves only as an individual seeks escape, promotion, or advantage over others. A worker who recognizes themselves as part of a class seeks solidarity, organization, and change. Class consciousness does not erase differences of background or experience, but it situates them within a shared material reality. It reveals that divisions among workers benefit those who own, and that unity among workers threatens the foundations of domination. Collective action grows directly from this awareness. Once people understand that their powerlessness is shared, they also discover that their power can be shared. Individually, workers appear weak and replaceable. Collectively, they are indispensable. Production, distribution, and services all depend on coordinated labor. And when that coordination is withdrawn or redirected, the system trembles. Collective action transforms labor from a commodity sold under compulsion into a force capable of negotiation, resistance, and transformation. This action is not spontaneous chaos, but organized struggle. It takes the form of unions, councils, movements, and political organizations that give structure to solidarity. Through organization, workers learn discipline, strategy, and mutual responsibility. They move from reaction to intention, from protest to purpose. Organization also preserves memory, carrying lessons from past struggles into the present, preventing each generation from starting again at the same point of defeat. The ruling class understands the danger of this process and works tirelessly to disrupt it. Repression, co-optation, legal restrictions, and ideological attacks are all deployed to weaken collective action. Concessions may be granted selectively to fragment movements, while leaders are isolated or absorbed into existing power structures. These responses reveal the truth that collective action exposes, that the power of capital depends on the passivity of labor. Class consciousness also reshapes the meaning of freedom. Under capitalism, freedom is defined narrowly as choice within the market, the ability to sell oneself under slightly better conditions. Revolutionary consciousness rejects this illusion and asserts a deeper freedom, the collective control over the conditions of life. It recognizes that no individual can be free in a society structured around exploitation, because freedom cannot exist where survival depends on submission. Revolution is not an event imposed from outside history, but the culmination of contradictions within it. As inequality deepens and crises recur, the gap between what exists and what is possible becomes impossible to ignore. Class consciousness gives this contradiction a voice, while collective action gives it force. Together, they turn discontent into direction and anger into purpose. These are called seeds because they develop over time, shaped by struggle, setbacks, and learning. They grow unevenly, face resistance, and require care. But once planted, they cannot be easily eradicated because they arise from lived reality itself. Every act of solidarity strengthens them, every shared victory deepens them, and every attempt to suppress them confirms their necessity. A society that produces wealth collectively but distributes it privately contains within itself the basis for its own transformation. When those who produce recognize this truth and act upon it together, history shifts from something that happened to them into something they actively shape, because class consciousness reveals the source of oppression, and collective action provides the means to overcome it, binding individuals into a force capable of confronting ownership, challenging authority, and reshaping social relations from the ground up. The truth that runs through every argument, every contradiction, and every struggle is this: the existing order survives only because it is accepted. Capitalism is not an eternal law, but historical arrangement upheld by ownership, division, and habit. Its power appears vast only because those who sustain it are kept unaware of their own strength. Once the illusion of normality is shattered, once exploitation is recognized as a social relation rather than a personal fate, the foundations of this system begin to erode. The future does not belong to those who hoard wealth, but to those who create it. Labor is the source of all value, and when labor becomes conscious of itself as a collective force, it becomes unstoppable. Unity transforms vulnerability into power, isolation into solidarity, and suffering into resolve. The same hands that build the world can reshape it, not through appeal to morality, but through organized action grounded in material reality. Revolution is not chaos, it is clarity. It is the moment when people refuse to live as objects within a system that treats them as expendable. It is the reclaiming of time, dignity, and purpose from relations that reduce life to profit. A society organized around collective ownership and democratic control is not only possible, but necessary, if humanity is to move beyond cycles of inequality, crisis, and domination. History has never advanced by waiting for permission. Every gain wrested from power was achieved through struggle, through unity, through the refusal to accept imposed limits. The task now is not to adapt more efficiently to exploitation, but to abolish the conditions that make it inevitable. When workers recognize themselves as a class, act as a class, and organize as a class, the old world begins to dissolve, and a new one takes shape through conscious, collective transformation.